Why are you here? The judge gasped when I walked into that Chicago courtroom last Tuesday, and in that moment, I knew my daughter-in-law Cassandra and her sleazy lawyer boyfriend were about to discover that the senile old mother-in-law they were trying to institutionalize was actually the Honorable Gloria Whitfield, one of the most respected family court judges in Illinois history. My name is Gloria. I'm 76 years old, and after 42 years on the bench deciding over 8,000 cases, I thought I'd seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable. I was wrong. Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come from those who should love you most, who think your age makes you an easy target, who mistake wisdom for weakness. For 8 months, I watched my late son's widow circle me like a vulture, sweet-talking about retirement communities, while her eyes calculated the value of my Lincoln Park Victorian. What she didn't know was that before I became anyone's mother-in-law, I was a judge who'd seen hundreds of elder abuse cases. I knew every manipulation tactic in the book because I'd prosecuted them all. When Cassandra filed that fraudulent petition claiming I had advanced dementia, complete with fake medical reports and hired actors posing as concerned neighbors, she made one fatal mistake. She assumed that at 76, I'd forgotten how to fight. She was about to learn that you don't spend for decades commanding a courtroom just to roll over when someone tries to steal your life's work. This is the story of how I used every legal precedent I'd ever memorized, every courtroom strategy I'd ever mastered, and every connection I'd built over nearly half a century to destroy the people who thought my age made me powerless. Because here's what predators never understand about us older women: we didn't survive this long by being weak. If you want to see how a retired judge takes down the scammers who underestimated her, hit that subscribe button and settle in. This grandmother's got a story that'll make you think twice about anyone who tries to mess with their elders. It started innocently enough, the way these things always do. 3 weeks after we buried my Benjamin in that cold February ground, Cassandra showed up at my door with a casserole and what I now recognize as the opening move in her chess game. She'd always been different from the daughters-in-law I'd seen in my courtroom over the years, too polished, too calculating. Benjamin met her at some corporate event 5 years ago when she was working in real estate development. Pretty enough, I suppose, with that glossy blonde hair and designer clothes that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But there was something about the way she looked at my house during family dinners, like she was appraising it. After the funeral, those visits became regular. Every Tuesday and Thursday, like clockwork, she'd bring soup, fuss over whether I was eating enough, and always steer the conversation toward my living situation. "Gloria, don't you think this house is awfully big for just one person?" she'd say, running her manicured fingers along my antique dining table. "All these stairs, all this maintenance. At your age, wouldn't a nice retirement community be so much easier?" At my age, those 3 words should have been my first warning. I'd spent 42 years listening to people lie to me in court. You develop an ear for it, a sixth sense that tingles when someone's feeding you a line. But grief does funny things to your judgment, and I was drowning in it. Benjamin had been my baby, my youngest, the one who still called me every Sunday to check if I needed anything from the store. By April, Cassandra's suggestions became more persistent. She brought brochures for active senior communities with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Village, places where, she assured me, I'd have friends my own age and wouldn't have to worry about home maintenance. "You've worked so hard your whole life, Gloria," she'd coo, patting my hand like I was a confused child. "Don't you think you deserve to relax? Let someone else handle all the responsibilities." The irony wasn't lost on me. This house on North Cleveland Avenue, the same house I'd bought in 1978 for $60,000 when I was a newly appointed judge, was now worth over $1,400,000. I'd raised 3 children here, buried 1 husband, and hosted Thanksgiving dinners for 38 years running. But suddenly, according to Cassandra, it was too much for me to handle. Then came Derek Walsh. Cassandra introduced him in May as her financial consultant, a silver-haired man in his 50s with the kind of practiced smile that set off every alarm bell in my judicial brain. He had that slick confidence of lawyers who'd rather settle than fight, who preferred backdoor deals to courtroom victories. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said during his first visit, spreading papers across my kitchen table like he owned the place, "Cassandra's told me about your concerns regarding estate planning. At your stage of life, asset protection becomes crucial." My stage of life. There were those words again. Derek explained how a family trust would protect my assets and ensure smooth inheritance. Procedures. The trust would name Cassandra as the primary administrator, given that she was younger and better equipped to handle complex financial decisions. I may have been 76, but I wasn't born yesterday. I'd overseen hundreds of probate cases, seen every trust scam imaginable. I appreciate your concern, I told him, but I've managed my own finances just fine for 7 decades. His smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. Of course, Mrs. Whitfield, but sometimes family members can provide valuable perspective on decisions that might be emotionally clouded. That's when I knew, not suspected, not wondered knew. This wasn't about protecting my assets. This was about transferring them. I started paying closer attention after that, how Cassandra's eyes lingered on my original artwork, my antique furniture, the crown molding that made this house architectural gold in Lincoln Park, how Derek always steered conversations toward my increasing isolation and declining cognitive function. Words he'd slip in casually, like seeds he was planting. The breaking point came on a humid Tuesday in June. I'd been napping in my study when I heard voices in the kitchen, Cassandra and Derek, speaking in hushed tones they thought wouldn't carry. Moving slower lately. More confused about dates, perfect timing with the medical documentation. Won't know what hit her until it's too late. I sat in that leather chair my late husband Martin had given me for my 60th birthday, feeling something inside me crystallized. Not hurt comes later. This was pure, cold recognition. The same feeling I used to get in court when a witness's story finally cracked open and revealed the truth underneath. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were planning to have me declared incompetent. When I walked back into that kitchen, Cassandra jumped like she'd been caught stealing cookies. Derek recovered faster, sliding papers into his briefcase with practiced ease. Gloria, you're awake. We were just discussing some insurance options that might benefit you. I looked at these two people in my kitchen, these vultures in expensive clothes, and felt 42 years of judicial authority settle around my shoulders like an old, familiar coat. How thoughtful, I said, my voice carrying just enough edge to let them know the game had changed. I'll certainly give it the consideration it deserves. After they left, I deadbolted my front door and called the one person I knew I could trust. Helen Kozłowski had been my closest friend since law school, my co-conspirator through 4 decades of legal battles, and the only other woman I knew who could smell a scam from 3 counties away. Helen, I said when she picked up, I need to tell you something, and then I need your help to destroy them, because they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought that being 76 made me vulnerable. They were about to learn it made me dangerous. 2 weeks after my kitchen revelation, the bomb arrived via certified mail. A legal petition requesting my immediate guardianship due to advanced dementia and diminished cognitive capacity. My own daughter-in-law was asking a court to declare me mentally incompetent. I sat at my dining room table, reading through 23 pages of lies typed on official letterhead, and felt something I hadn't experienced in all my years on the bench: the cold fury of being on the receiving end of legal manipulation. They'd done their homework. I had to give them that. The petition included a psychological evaluation from Dr. Marcus Brennan claiming I showed significant cognitive decline, paranoid delusions, and inability to manage financial affairs. There were photographs of my house supposedly showing dangerous hoarding behavior, pictures of my study with books scattered across the floor and my kitchen with dishes piled in the sink. I recognized those scenes because I remembered the day Cassandra had insisted on helping me organize and left both rooms in deliberate chaos. Most disturbing were the sworn affidavits from 3 neighbors describing my erratic behavior and concerning interactions. Mrs. Patricia Chen from next door allegedly witnessed me arguing with imaginary people in my garden and leaving my front door unlocked for hours. Robert Martinez from across the street swore he'd seen me wandering the neighborhood in my nightgown at 3 a.m., appearing confused and disoriented. The problem: I'd never met Patricia Chen or Robert Martinez in my life. I called Helen immediately. At 78, she was 2 years older than me, but sharp as a surgical blade, with 50 years of legal experience and a network of connections that spanned every courthouse in Illinois. Gloria, she said after I read her the petition, this is sophisticated fraud. They've created an entire false narrative backed by fabricated evidence. But they made mistakes. They always do. The first mistake was Dr. Marcus Brennan. Helen had her assistant research him while we stayed on the phone. Within an hour, we discovered that Brennan had been sanctioned twice by the Illinois Department of Professional Regulation for accepting payment for evaluations of patients he had never examined. More interesting, his medical license showed an address in Naperville, the same suburb where Derek Walsh maintained his law office. Convenient coincidence, Helen observed dryly. The second mistake was those neighbor affidavits. I'd lived on North Cleveland Avenue for 45 years. I knew every family within 3 blocks, had watched their children grow up, attended their graduation parties and wedding receptions. Patricia Chen and Robert Martinez weren't my neighbors, they were fabrications. But here's what really got my blood boiling. Buried in the financial documents was a power of attorney form they wanted the court to grant Cassandra, giving her immediate control over my bank accounts, investment portfolio, and property deed. They weren't just planning to have me declared incompetent, they were positioning themselves to liquidate my assets the moment a judge signed the order. Helen and I spent the next 3 days building our defense strategy like we were preparing for the Supreme Court. First, I scheduled appointments with 3 independent neurologists for comprehensive cognitive evaluations: Dr. Sarah Mitchell at Northwestern Memorial, Dr. James Park at University of Chicago Medical Center, and Dr. Elena Rodriguez at Rush University Medical Center. All 3 confirmed what I already knew: my cognitive function was not just normal for my age, it was superior. While I was proving my mental competency, Helen was dismantling their fake evidence. She hired Marcus Chunno, relation to the fictional Patricia private investigator who specialized in insurance fraud. Within a week, Marcus had traced the mysterious neighbors to a talent agency in Wicker Park that provided background actors for corporate videos and legal demonstrations. The photography fraud was even easier to expose. I'd installed a home security system 3 years ago after a break-in 2 blocks over. The timestamp on their hoarding photos showed they were taken on June 15 at 2:47 p.m., exactly when Cassandra had been in my house supposedly helping me organize, and exactly when my security cameras captured her deliberately scattering books and dishes around to create chaos. But the smoking gun came when Marcus dug into Derek Walsh's financial records. 2 weeks after Benjamin's funeral, Derek and Cassandra had formed a limited liability company called Lincoln Park Development Group. The business plan, filed with the Secretary of State, outlined their intention to acquire and renovate historic properties for luxury residential conversion. Property number 1 on their acquisition list, 1247 North Cleveland Avenue, my address. They'd already obtained architectural drawings for converting my 3-story Victorian into 4 luxury condominiums. They had estimates from contractors, marketing projections from real estate firms, and profit calculations showing a potential return of $2.5 million, all based on their assumption that they'd gained control of my property through the guardianship fraud. I sat in Helen's office on a Thursday afternoon in July, surrounded by bankers' boxes full of evidence, and felt the same satisfaction I used to get when a complex case finally came together. Every lie had been exposed, every fraud documented, every co-conspirator identified. There's one more thing, Helen said, sliding a final folder across her desk. Marcus found something interesting about your daughter-in-law's relationship with Derek Walsh. The folder contained restaurant receipts, hotel registrations, and credit card statements dating back to years. Cassandra and Derek had been having an affair since long before Benjamin's death. More damning, Marcus had located text messages between them from 3 months before the accident, discussing how Benjamin had become suspicious and might complicate their timeline. I thought about my son, about how he'd seemed troubled in those final weeks, how he'd mentioned wanting to talk to me about something important. We'd planned lunch for the weekend after his accident, a lunch that never happened. The final piece fell into place when Helen showed me the court assignment. Judge Sharon Martinez would be presiding over my competency hearing. Sharon, my former student from Northwestern Law, class of 1998, the brilliant young woman I'd mentored through her first 3 years of practice, whose judicial appointment recommendation I'd personally written to the governor. They have no idea who they're dealing with, Helen said, closing the last folder with a satisfied snap. I looked at my oldest friend, my legal co-conspirator, my fellow warrior in a system we'd spent our lives serving. At 76, I'd thought my courtroom days were behind me. I was wrong, Helen, I said, my voice carrying the steel that had commanded respect in family court for 4 decades. It's time to remind them that you don't mess with a judge retired or otherwise. They thought they were playing chess with a confused old woman. They were about to discover they'd entered a legal battlefield with someone who'd written the rules. The art of judicial deception is something they don't teach in law school. But you learn it fast when you're a woman fighting for respect in a 1980s courtroom. You smile when you want to snarl, you nod when you want to object, and you let your opponents underestimate you until the moment you destroy them. It was time to dust off those old skills. 3 days after Helen and I finished building our case, Cassandra called to schedule one of her regular visits. I could hear the smugness in her voice, the barely contained excitement of someone who thought victory was within reach. She probably expected to find me panicked about the legal papers, maybe even grateful for her offer to help me through this difficult time. Instead, I decided to give her exactly what she expected: a confused, frightened old woman who was finally ready to surrender. When she arrived that Tuesday afternoon, I answered the door in my oldest housecoat, my hair deliberately mussed, moving with the shuffling uncertainty I'd watched so many genuinely impaired clients display over the years. The performance began the moment I opened that front door. I let my voice quaver as I told her how scared I was about the legal papers, how I didn't understand what they meant, how grateful I was that she was there to help me figure everything out. Cassandra practically glowed with satisfaction, her eyes already calculating how quickly she could expedite the guardianship process. She'd brought Derek with her, and watching him try to contain his excitement was almost amusing. He spread more papers across my kitchen table, speaking in that patronizing tone people use with children and the elderly, explaining how the guardianship would protect me from making any more confused decisions. The beauty of playing confused is that people tell you things they'd never reveal to someone they thought was sharp. Derek outlined their entire timeline, how quickly they could get me placed in a nice facility, how the house sale would proceed, how my assets would be properly managed for my own good. He even mentioned that they'd already identified a buyer for my property, someone willing to pay above market value for a quick closing. What he didn't know was that I was wearing a digital recorder Helen had given me, a tiny device that looked like a hearing aid but captured every word of their confession. Cassandra reached across the table and patted my hand with fake sympathy as she told me not to worry about anything, that she and Derek would handle all the complicated legal stuff. She assured me that the residential facility they'd chosen was lovely, with activities and people my own age, where I wouldn't have to worry about maintaining this big house anymore. The facility she described was a memory care unit in Schaumburg, 45 minutes from the city, far enough to make regular visits inconvenient for anyone who might question my placement there. I nodded along, letting her believe I was grateful for her concern, while internally cataloging every detail of their plan. Derek then made the mistake that would ultimately seal their fate, believing I was too confused to understand the implications. He explained exactly how they'd been building the case against me. He admitted they'd hired actors to pose as concerned neighbors, acknowledging that my real neighbors had been uncooperative when approached about my alleged behavior. He mentioned that Dr. Brennan had been very accommodating about providing the necessary medical documentation without requiring an actual examination. Most damning of all, he bragged about how the photographs of my house had been strategically arranged to show evidence of hoarding and cognitive decline. Cassandra actually laughed as she described how easy it had been to mess up my study and kitchen during her organizing visit, knowing I'd be too polite to complain about the chaos she'd left behind. As they talked, I let my eyes wander around my kitchen with what I hoped looked like confused nostalgia. In reality, I was thinking about how this room had been the heart of my family for 45 years, how I'd taught my children to cook at that counter, how Martin and I had shared thousands of cups of coffee at that table, how Benjamin had done his homework in the breakfast nook every day after school. They were planning to destroy all of that so they could add another $1.5 million to their bank account. When Derek started explaining the power of attorney documents, describing how Cassandra would be able to make all my financial decisions, I forced tears into my eyes and told him how overwhelming it all seemed. He reassured me that confusion was normal at my age, that signing over control of my affairs was the responsible thing to do. The responsible thing to do. This from a man who was conspiring to commit elder abuse, insurance fraud, and probably accessory to murder if they'd had anything to do with Benjamin's convenient accident. As they prepared to leave, Cassandra promised to return the next day with the final papers for me to sign. She suggested I not worry my other children about any of this, since legal matters could be confusing for people who weren't directly involved. She wanted to handle everything quietly and efficiently. What she meant was that she wanted to isolate me from anyone who might interfere with their theft. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, thinking about the performance I'd just given. 42 years ago, when I was a young lawyer fighting for credibility in a male-dominated profession, I'd learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is letting your opponent think you're harmless. Derek and Cassandra had just spent 2 hours confessing to multiple felonies because they believed I was a helpless old woman who couldn't understand or remember what they were telling me. They'd revealed their timeline, their methods, their co-conspiracies, and their ultimate goals, all because they thought my age made me invisible. I called Helen to report on the afternoon's intelligence gathering. When I played back the recording, we could hear Derek clearly stating that the medical evaluation was fraudulent, Cassandra admitting to staging the photographs, and both of them acknowledging that they'd hired actors to provide false testimony. In 3 days, I would walk into Judge Sharon Martinez's courtroom, and Derek Walsh would discover what every law student learns: eventually ever underestimate a judge, even a retired one, especially a retired one who's had 42 years to perfect the art of strategic patience. They thought they were weeks away from institutionalizing me and stealing my life's work. They had no idea they'd just handed me everything I needed to destroy them. The game was almost over, and they still didn't realize they were playing against the master. The next morning, I woke up with the clarity that comes from decades of courtroom experience, that moment when you know exactly how to dismantle your opponent's case, piece by piece. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Helen arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with Marcus Chen and enough legal documents to fill my dining room table. What we discovered over the next 4 hours made Derek and Cassandra's scheme look like child's play compared to the sophisticated fraud operation they'd actually constructed. Marcus had spent the previous week following the money trail, and what he'd found was staggering. Lincoln Park Development Group wasn't just some hastily formed LLC, was the culmination of a 2-year plan that had begun long before Benjamin's death. Derek and Cassandra had been systematically identifying elderly property owners in high-value neighborhoods, researching their family situations, and positioning themselves to exploit inheritance opportunities. I wasn't their first target, I was their fifth. Marcus showed me files on 4 other elderly homeowners Derek had represented over the past 18 months. All had been declared incompetent through similar fraudulent proceedings. All had their properties transferred to family trusts managed by Derek's firm. All had died within 6 months of being institutionalized. The pattern was identical in every case. A family member would approach Derek, claiming concern about an elderly relative's mental capacity. Derek would arrange for Dr. Brennan to provide a diagnosis of dementia without conducting an actual examination. The same talent agency would provide fake neighbors to testify about erratic behavior. Within weeks, the elderly person would be declared incompetent and placed in the same memory care facility in Schaumburg, once isolated from family and friends. With Derek controlling their assets, these elderly victims would mysteriously decline rapidly. The official causes of death were always natural complications from dementia, heart failure, pneumonia, nothing that would raise suspicions. But the timeline was remarkably consistent. 6 months from guardianship to grave. Marcus had obtained financial records showing that Derek's firm had collected over $4 million in administrative fees from managing these elderly clients' estates. More disturbing, he'd traced payments from Derek to the memory care facility's substantial monthly bonuses that coincided with the deaths of his clients. "Gloria," Helen said, her voice tight with anger, "this isn't just elder abuse. This is systematic murder for profit." The realization hit me like a physical blow. If I'd signed those papers, if I'd allowed them to proceed with their guardianship petition, I would have been dead within 6 months. My house would have been sold, my assets liquidated, and my death would have looked like the natural end of a confused old woman who couldn't handle the stress of losing her independence. Benjamin's accident suddenly took on a more sinister context. Marcus had requested the police report and found several inconsistencies that hadn't been investigated. Benjamin's car had gone off Lakeshore Drive on a clear Tuesday morning, hitting a barrier at precisely the spot where surveillance cameras had conveniently malfunctioned the night before. The toxicology report showed traces of a sedative that Benjamin's doctor had never prescribed. My son hadn't died in an accident. He'd been murdered because he'd discovered Cassandra's affair and was planning to divorce her, which would have disrupted their timeline for inheriting his mother's property. I sat in my dining room, surrounded by evidence of my daughter-in-law's involvement in my son's murder, and felt something I'd never experienced in 4 decades of handling the worst family court cases imaginable. This wasn't just legal warfare anymore. This was personal justice for Benjamin. But proving murder would be complicated and time-consuming. The guardianship hearing was in 3 days, and that's where I could stop them immediately. Marcus had uncovered one crucial weakness in their operation. They'd grown overconfident and careless. Dr. Brennan had used the same psychological evaluation template for all 5 elderly victims, changing only the names and dates. The fake neighbors had given nearly identical testimony in each case, with the same talent agency recycling actors across multiple proceedings. Derek had even used the same photographer to stage hoarding evidence in each victim's home. Most importantly, we'd discovered that Judge Patricia Wong, who had presided over the 4 previous guardianship cases, was Derek's ex-wife. She'd been rubber-stamping his fraudulent petitions in exchange for a percentage of the estate management fees. Judge Wong wasn't assigned to my case because Helen had quietly requested a different judge, citing a scheduling conflict. Instead, we'd gotten Sharon Martinez, my former student, who had no idea she was about to oversee the legal destruction of the most sophisticated elder abuse ring in Illinois history. Helen and I spent the evening organizing our evidence into what she called the prosecution file. We had financial records proving the conspiracy, audio recordings of Derek and Cassandra confessing to fraud, medical documentation proving my competency, and photographic evidence of their staged crime scenes. But the piece de resistance was something Marcus had discovered entirely by accident. While researching Derek's client list, he'd found email correspondence between Derek and Cassandra dating back 3 years. Not only did it prove their affair had begun while Benjamin was alive, but it contained detailed discussions of their long-term investment strategy, targeting wealthy widows and aging property owners. One email from Cassandra, sent just 2 weeks after Benjamin's funeral, was particularly damning. She'd written to Derek about how much easier their plan would be now that Benjamin couldn't interfere, and how my advanced age and recent grief made me the perfect target for their standard protocol. My son's widow had been planning to steal from me before his body was even cold. As Helen packed up the files that night, she looked at me with the fierce satisfaction I remembered from our law school days when we'd solved a particularly challenging case. "Tomorrow, we contact the FBI," she said. "This conspiracy crosses state lines and involves mail fraud, wire fraud, and potentially murder. But first, we're going to destroy them in family court." I walked her to the door, thinking about how different my life had been just 6 months ago. I'd been a retired judge, enjoying my golden years, missing my husband and son, but content with the legacy I'd built. Now, I was about to become the key witness in one of the largest elder abuse prosecutions in Illinois history. At 76, I'd thought my days of seeking justice were behind me. Instead, I was about to fight the most important case of my career, not as a judge, but as a victim who refused to be silenced. Derek and Cassandra had made one fatal error in their calculations. They'd assumed that being elderly and recently widowed made me vulnerable. What they'd failed to consider was that it also made me absolutely fearless. I had nothing left to lose except my dignity and my legacy. And I'd be damned if I was going to let a pair of murderous thieves take those from me without the fight of their lives. The morning before our courtroom confrontation, I did something I hadn't done in 15 years of retirement. Put on my judicial robes. Not literally, of course. Those hung in a cedar closet upstairs, a reminder of a career that had shaped for decades of my life. But mentally, spiritually, I wrapped myself in the authority and wisdom that 42 years on the bench had given me. I was no longer just Gloria Whitfield, vulnerable widow and grieving mother. I was the Honorable Gloria Whitfield, and it was time to remind everyone what that meant. Helen arrived at 7 a.m. with coffee and what she called our nuclear option, something Marcus had discovered during his final night of investigation that would end this case before Derek could even present his opening argument. "You're going to love this," she said, spreading documents across my kitchen table with the satisfied smile of a prosecutor who'd just found the smoking gun. Marcus had been digging deeper into Dr. Brennan's background when he stumbled across something extraordinary. 3 months ago, Brennan had been arrested in Wisconsin for running an identical guardianship fraud scheme with a different partner. The case was still pending, but the Wisconsin Attorney General's office had obtained recordings of Brennan admitting to creating fraudulent psychological evaluations for elderly victims he'd never examined. More importantly, in those recordings, Brennan specifically mentioned his Illinois operation with Derek Walsh, describing it as his most lucrative partnership and detailing exactly how they'd murdered 4 elderly victims by coordinating with corrupt staff at the Schaumburg Memory Care Facility. The Wisconsin DA had been building a RICO case against Brennan's entire network, but hadn't yet connected it to Derek's Illinois operation. Until now, Helen had spent the night coordinating with federal prosecutors who were thrilled to discover the Illinois connection to their ongoing investigation. They'd been watching Derek for months, waiting for enough evidence to move against him. My case was the final piece they needed. But here's what made this absolutely perfect. The FBI had been conducting surveillance on Derek for the past 6 weeks. They had photographs of him meeting with Brennan, recordings of phone calls where they discussed my case, and financial records showing payments from Derek to the memory care facility staff who'd helped murder the previous victims. The federal prosecutors wanted Derek and Cassandra to proceed with the guardianship hearing, so they could catch them in the act of committing fraud before a judge. They'd even arranged for FBI agents to be present in the courtroom, posing as court observers, ready to make arrests the moment Derek presented his falsified evidence. I was about to witness the live destruction of a murder conspiracy from the witness stand. Helen also brought news about Judge Sharon Martinez. She'd discreetly contacted Sharon's chambers to provide background on my judicial career, ensuring that Sharon understood the significance of having her former mentor appear in her courtroom. Sharon had responded with a formal note expressing her honor at presiding over a case involving her most respected teacher and promising that justice would be served with the dignity my career deserved. More importantly, Sharon had reviewed the case file and immediately spotted the same red flags that Helen and I had identified. She'd already ordered an independent court-appointed attorney to review Derek's petition, and that attorney had found so many procedural violations that he'd recommended the case be referred for criminal investigation. But we weren't going to wait for bureaucratic processes. We were going to end this ourselves, in public, with the full weight of my judicial reputation behind every word. I spent that afternoon doing something I'd done before every major trial during my career. I visited Benjamin's grave. Forest Hill Cemetery was quiet on that Thursday afternoon. With autumn leaves beginning to turn and the Chicago skyline visible in the distance, I stood beside my son's headstone, thinking about how different his life might have been if he'd lived to divorce Cassandra and expose her crimes. I told him about what we'd discovered, about how we were going to get justice, not just for me, but for him and the 4 other victims who'd died for Derek and Cassandra's greed. I promised him that his mother wasn't going to go quietly into any memory care facility, that the people who'd killed him were going to pay for every lie they'd told and every life they'd stolen. The wind picked up as I spoke, scattering leaves across the cemetery, and for a moment I could almost hear Benjamin's voice encouraging me, the way he had when I'd faced difficult cases during my career. He'd always been proud of his mother, the judge, always bragging to his friends about how she fought for families who couldn't fight for themselves. Tomorrow, I'd be fighting for my own family, and for every elderly person who'd ever been dismissed, underestimated, or targeted because someone thought age made them powerless. That evening, Helen and I conducted one final review of our strategy. The plan was simple: let Derek present his fraudulent case first, allow him to dig his hole as deep as possible, then systematically destroy every piece of his evidence while federal agents documented each lie for the criminal prosecution. I would testify last, and when I took that witness stand, I would remind everyone in that courtroom, including Derek and Cassandra, that respect isn't something you lose when you turn 70. It's something you earn over a lifetime of service, and it doesn't disappear just because someone thinks you're an easy target. Helen looked at me across my dining room table, this brilliant woman who'd been my closest friend for 50 years, and asked if I was ready for what tomorrow would bring. I thought about Martin, who'd supported my judicial career, even when it meant missed dinners and weekend work. I thought about Benjamin, who'd paid with his life for discovering his wife's true nature. I thought about the 4 elderly victims who died alone and forgotten because they didn't have the legal knowledge to fight back. At 76, I'd spent my entire adult life serving justice. Tomorrow, justice would finally serve me. Helen, I said, my voice carrying the quiet authority that had commanded respect in family court for 4 decades, they picked the wrong old woman to mess with. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh and Cassandra would learn what every lawyer discovers eventually: You don't lie to a judge and expect to walk away unscathed, especially when that judge has had 42 years to perfect the art of legal destruction. The game was almost over, and they still had no idea they'd been playing against the House the entire time. The night before the hearing, I couldn't sleep, not from nerves. I'd faced hostile courtrooms for 4 decades, but from the electric anticipation of someone who knows they're about to deliver perfect justice. I spent those quiet hours walking through my house, touching the furniture Martin and I had chosen together, looking at family photographs that chronicled 45 years of memories these thieves thought they could steal. By dawn, I knew exactly how this would end. Helen arrived at 6 a.m. with final intelligence from Marcus and the FBI team. What she told me over coffee in my kitchen made me understand that we weren't just stopping a fraud, we were dismantling an entire criminal enterprise that had been operating for years. The federal surveillance had captured Derek meeting with Judge Patricia Wong the previous afternoon. Wong, his ex-wife who'd been rubber-stamping fraudulent guardianship petitions, was panicking about the FBI investigation Marcus had triggered. The agents had recorded Derek assuring her that my case would be quick and clean because I was too old and grief-stricken to mount any real defense. He'd actually told his co-conspirator that I was the perfect victim because aging widows were naturally confused and easily manipulated by family members who seemed caring. Marcus had also discovered the most damning evidence yet. Detailed financial projections. Derek had prepared for potential investors in Lincoln Park Development Group. The documents outlined their plan to acquire at least 20 elderly-owned properties over the next 3 years through strategic guardianship interventions. They'd calculated that each elderly victim would generate an average of $1.8 million in profit through property sales and estate management fees. My house was listed as asset acquisition number 5, with a projected timeline showing my death within 6 months of institutionalization and property liquidation by the following spring. They'd already assigned my address to a development team and received preliminary bids from contractors who planned to convert my Victorian into luxury condominiums. But here's what made my blood run cold. They'd also prepared similar profiles for 12 other elderly homeowners in Lincoln Park, Lakeview, and the Gold Coast. Detailed dossiers, including property values, family relationships, health information, and vulnerability assessments. They were planning a systematic campaign of elder murder across Chicago's most valuable neighborhoods. Every one of those potential victims was someone like Mia, widow or widower living alone in a property worth over $1 million, with family members who might be willing to betray them for money. The FBI had enough evidence to arrest Derek and Cassandra immediately, but they wanted to catch them committing fraud in open court, on the record, with the judge as witness. The federal prosecutor, Sarah Chun, Marcus's daughter, as it turned out, explained that prosecuting elder abuse was often difficult because victims died before they could testify. Having a retired judge survive their murder attempt and expose their methods would create precedent for protecting other elderly victims nationwide. I was about to become the face of a federal campaign against elder abuse, whether I wanted to or not. Helen and I spent the morning reviewing every detail of our presentation. The beauty of our position was that we didn't need to prove Derek and Cassandra were guilty, we just needed to prove I was competent. Once the guardianship petition was denied, the federal charges would follow automatically. But I wanted more than just legal victory. I wanted public humiliation for these people who'd killed my son and planned to kill me. I wanted them to understand that their fundamental assumption that age equals vulnerability was not just wrong but catastrophically stupid. At noon, Helen received a call that changed everything. Judge Sharon Martinez had reviewed our preliminary evidence and made an unprecedented decision. She was opening the afternoon hearing to the press and inviting court reporters to witness what she called a landmark case in elder rights protection. My former student understood that this case would set precedent for how the legal system protects elderly citizens from family predators. She wanted Derek and Cassandra's defeat to be as public and humiliating as possible. More importantly, Sharon had coordinated with the FBI to ensure that Derek would have every opportunity to present his fraudulent evidence before federal agents moved in for arrests. The hearing would be allowed to proceed until Derek had completely incriminated himself. Then the criminal charges would be filed in open court. As Helen and I prepared to leave for the courthouse, I made one final decision that would have shocked my younger self, but felt absolutely right at 76. I called my other two children, Robert in Seattle and Margaret in Denver, and told them to watch the Chicago news that evening. I explained that their sister-in-law had tried to destroy their mother, and they were about to see justice served in a way that would make them proud of the family they came from. For the first time since Benjamin's funeral, I felt the fierce joy that comes from absolute certainty about your purpose. These criminals had targeted me because they thought my age made me weak, isolated, and defenseless. They were about to discover that it actually made me experienced, connected, and completely ruthless. Helen drove us downtown through the autumn afternoon, past the neighborhoods where I'd raised my children and built my career. Chicago looked exactly the same as it had 40 years ago when I'd first taken the bench, but I felt fundamentally different than the young woman who'd fought for respect in a male-dominated profession. That young judge had needed to prove herself worthy of the authority she'd been given. The woman walking into the courthouse today had already earned that authority through 4 decades of service, and anyone who challenged it was going to pay the full price. As we approached the courthouse steps, Helen asked me one final time if I was ready for what would happen when we walked through those doors. I looked up at the building where I'd spent the best years of my career, where I'd delivered justice to thousands of families, where I'd learned that truth always wins when it's backed by preparation and courage. Helen, I said, feeling 42 years of judicial authority settling around me like armor. They have no idea what's about to hit them. Tomorrow, Derek Walsh and Cassandra would learn the most important lesson any criminal can learn: never underestimate a judge who's had a lifetime to perfect the art of justice. The reckoning was about to begin. The moment I walked into that Chicago courtroom, everything changed, not just for me, but for Derek, for Cassandra, for every person in that room who thought they understood what was about to happen. The air itself seemed to shift as I stepped through those familiar doors. Wearing my navy blue suit, the same one I'd worn to deliver verdicts in my most important cases, with my silver hair, styled exactly as it had been during my final year on the bench. I wasn't shuffling. I wasn't confused. I wasn't the fragile, grief-stricken widow they'd been manipulating for 8 months. I was the Honorable Gloria Whitfield, and my presence commanded the room with 42 years of accumulated authority. Cassandra saw me first. She was sitting at the petitioner's table with Derek, probably expecting to see a broken old woman clutching Helen's arm for support. Instead, she watched me stride down that center aisle with the confident bearing of someone who'd owned courtrooms for 4 decades. Her face went pale, then red, then a sickly yellow color I'd never seen on a human being before. Derek turned to see what had captured Cassandra's attention, and I watched him experience what I can only describe as the legal equivalent of cardiac arrest. His mouth actually fell open as he realized that the senile old woman he'd been scheming against was walking into his fraudulent hearing with the posture and presence of someone who belonged in that courtroom far more than he ever would. But the real moment, the one that made 8 months of manipulation and betrayal worthwhile, came when Judge Sharon Martinez looked up from her paperwork and saw me approaching the witness area. Her eyes widened in recognition, then filled with something that looked like relief mixed with absolute delight. She couldn't hide her smile as she realized that her most respected mentor was about to teach her the courtroom lesson of a lifetime. When Sharon asked why I was there, gasping with surprise, I felt every piece of this elaborate chess game finally clicking into place. I stopped directly in front of the bench, looked up at my former student with the same pride I'd felt watching her graduate from law school 27 years ago, and explained that I was there because my daughter-in-law was attempting to defraud the court system. I'd spent my life serving. The word murder hung in the air like a thunderclap when I mentioned it. I heard Cassandra gasp behind me, heard Derek's chair scrape against the floor as he tried to stand, probably planning some objection that would only make things worse for him. Judge Martinez leaned forward, her expression shifting from surprise to the focused intensity I remembered from her law school days when she was working through a particularly complex legal problem. When she asked me to state my background for the record, I felt 42 years of judicial authority settle around me like armor. I identified myself as Gloria Marie Whitfield, retired judge of the Circuit Court of Cook County, Family Division, explaining that I had served on the bench for 42 years, presiding over approximately 8,000 cases involving family law, guardianship disputes, and elder protection. I was also, I added regrettably, the target of the fraudulent guardianship petition that Derek had filed in her courtroom. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the court reporter's fingers frozen over her keyboard. could sense the FBI agents positioned around the room, tensing for what they knew was coming. Derek was finally standing now, his face the color of ash, probably trying to figure out if there was any possible way to withdraw his petition without admitting to fraud. There wasn't. Helen approached the bench with our evidence folders, moving with the crisp efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this moment her entire career. She'd arranged our documentation in the order that would create maximum impact. My medical evaluations first, then the proof of Derek's fabricated evidence, then the financial records showing his murder conspiracy, and finally, the federal wire surveillance that had captured him confessing to multiple felonies. Helen requested permission to present evidence that this guardianship petition represented not just fraud against me, but conspiracy to commit elder abuse, insurance fraud, and murder. Judge Martinez nodded, and I watched Derek's last hope of controlling this situation disappear. He was about to watch his entire criminal enterprise exposed in open court, with federal agents documenting every revelation for the criminal prosecution that would follow. Helen began with my medical evaluations. Dr. Sarah Mitchell from Northwestern Memorial had written a comprehensive report stating that my cognitive function was not just normal for my age, but superior to average. Dr. James Park from University of Chicago had tested my memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity, concluding that I showed exceptional mental acuity for any age group. Dr. Elena Rodriguez from Rush had specifically examined me for signs of dementia, finding no evidence of cognitive impairment whatsoever. Then Helen presented Derek's fake medical evidence, Dr. Marcus Brennan's evaluation, which claimed I suffered from advanced dementia and severe cognitive decline, was dated 2 weeks before Dr. Brennan's arrest in Wisconsin for providing identical fraudulent evaluations in a separate elder abuse case. The fake neighbor testimony crumbled next. Helen showed the court receipts from the Wicker Park Talent Agency that had provided actors to pose as Patricia Chen and Robert Martinez. The same actors had given nearly identical testimony in 4 previous guardianship cases involving Derek's other elderly victims. But the moment that destroyed Derek completely came when Helen played the recording from my kitchen. The courtroom heard Derek's voice clearly admitting that the medical evaluation was fraudulent, Cassandra acknowledging that she'd staged the photographs of my house, and both of them discussing their timeline for having me declared incompetent and institutionalized. Derek tried to object, claiming the recording was inadmissible. But Judge Martinez cut him off with a look that could have frozen Lake Michigan. She told him that he had filed a petition requesting guardianship of a retired judge based on fabricated medical evidence and perjured testimony, then confessed to this fraud while believing his victim was too impaired to understand his admissions. She suggested he remain silent while the court determined exactly how many laws he'd broken. Helen's presentation continued with the financial evidence, bank records showing Derek and Cassandra's LLC formed 2 weeks after Benjamin's funeral, architectural plans for converting my house into condominiums, profit projections calculating $2.5 million from my property sale, payments to the memory care facility where Derek's previous victims had died under suspicious circumstances. Finally, Helen presented the federal surveillance evidence, photographs of Derek meeting with his co-conspirators, phone recordings discussing my case, financial transfers showing payments for the fraudulent medical evaluation, and fake witness testimony. When Helen finished, the courtroom was silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's pen and the sound of Derek's labored breathing. Judge Martinez looked directly at me, and I saw in her eyes the same respect and admiration I'd hoped to earn from my students throughout my teaching career. She asked if I would like to address the court, and I stood slowly, feeling every one of my 76 years, but also feeling the accumulated power of 4 decades spent seeking justice for families who couldn't protect themselves. I told the court that I had spent my entire adult life protecting elderly citizens from exactly this kind of exploitation, and that I stood before the court not as a judge, but as a victim who refused to be silenced. I turned to face Derek and Cassandra directly, letting them see the full force of my anger and determination. I explained that these individuals had targeted me because they believed my age made me vulnerable, that they had murdered my son to accelerate their timeline, and that they had planned to kill me within 6 months of stealing my property. They had underestimated not just my cognitive abilities, but my connections, my experience, and my absolute refusal to let them destroy what I'd spent a lifetime building. I requested that the fraudulent petition be denied. that these individuals be charged with conspiracy to commit elder abuse and murder, and that the courts send a clear message that senior citizens would not be treated as easy targets by criminals who mistake age for weakness. Judge Martinez nodded solemnly, then delivered the verdict that would end Derek and Cassandra's criminal career forever. She denied the petition for guardianship, finding clear and convincing evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse. She instructed the bailiff to escort the federal agents forward and informed Derek and Cassandra that they were under arrest. As FBI agents moved through the courtroom to take Derek and Cassandra into custody, I felt a satisfaction deeper than any verdict I'd ever delivered from the bench. Derek looked at me with absolute bewilderment, finally understanding that the helpless old woman he'd been manipulating was actually one of the most formidable legal minds in Illinois. Cassandra was crying, probably realizing that her plan to murder her mother-in-law and steal her inheritance had just earned her a life sentence in federal prison. Justice had been served, and the predators who'd thought they could destroy me had learned the hardest lesson of their lives. Never underestimate a judge, retired or otherwise. The game was over, and they'd just discovered they'd been playing against the house the entire time. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my new condominium overlooking Lake Michigan, sipping coffee from the china set Martin gave me for our 20th anniversary, watching the sunrise paint the water gold, and thinking about how differently my life has unfolded than anyone could have predicted. Derek Walsh was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for conspiracy, elder abuse, insurance fraud, and accessory to murder. The judge who sentenced him ironically, another one of my former students, told him that his crimes represented a betrayal of everything the legal profession should stand for. Derek's law license was permanently revoked, and he'll spend what's left of his career making license plates instead of manipulating vulnerable families. Cassandra received 15 years for her role in the conspiracy, plus additional charges for Benjamin's murder once the FBI completed their investigation into his death. The autopsy they conducted after exhuming his body confirmed what we'd suspected: he'd been drugged with a powerful sedative before his car went off Lakeshore Drive. Cassandra had been slowly poisoning him for weeks, probably hoping his death would look like a medical episode rather than an accident. My daughter-in-law, who'd called me confused and tried to have me institutionalized, broke down completely during her sentencing hearing. She begged the judge for mercy, claiming she'd been manipulated by Derek, that she'd never intended for things to go so far. But the federal prosecutor, Sarah Chen, Marcus's brilliant daughter, presented evidence showing Cassandra had been the mastermind behind the entire operation. Derek had been her weapon, not her leader. Dr. Marcus Brennan received 30 years for his role in the murder conspiracy that had killed 5 elderly victims across 2 states. The memory care facility in Schaumburg was shut down permanently, and 3 staff members were charged with negligent homicide for their roles in accelerating the deaths of Derek's previous victims. Judge Patricia Wong, Derek's ex-wife who'd been rubber-stamping fraudulent guardianship petitions, was removed from the bench and sentenced to 10 years for judicial corruption. The Illinois Supreme Court launched a comprehensive review of every guardianship case she'd overseen, discovering that at least 15 elderly victims had been murdered through Derek's scheme over the past 3 years. But the justice that mattered most to me was personal. I sold my Lincoln Park Victorian by choice, on my terms, for $1,600,000 to a young family with 3 children who promised to fill it with the kind of laughter it had known when my own kids were small. I used part of the proceeds to buy this beautiful condominium in a building with 24-hour security, a doorman who calls me Judge Whitfield, and a view that reminds me every morning that I'm still here, still fighting, still winning. $300,000 went to establish the Benjamin Whitfield Foundation for Elder Protection, a legal aid organization that provides free representation to elderly citizens facing guardianship fraud. Helen serves as the foundation's legal director, and we've already helped 12 families expose similar schemes across the Midwest. The foundation has become a model for elder protection programs nationwide, and I've been invited to speak at law schools across the country about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. The irony isn't lost on me that at 76, I've found a new career as an advocate for senior citizens' rights. Last month, I testified before a Senate subcommittee about strengthening federal protections for elderly Americans. Next week, I'm flying to California to consult on a case involving a 90-year-old woman whose grandson is trying to steal her Malibu beach house through forged documents. Age, I've learned, doesn't make you vulnerable, it makes you experienced. And experience, when combined with righteous anger and for decades of legal knowledge, is the most dangerous weapon any criminal can face. My other children, Robert and Margaret, flew in from Seattle and Denver for Derek and Cassandra's sentencing hearings. They told me how proud they were that their mother had fought back, that she'd shown the world what it really means to age with dignity and strength. Robert said watching me testify reminded him of why he'd been so proud to tell his friends that his mom was a judge. Margaret said she hoped she'd have half my courage when she reached my age, but the validation that meant the most came from Judge Sharon Martinez, who sent me a handwritten note after the trial. She wrote that watching me reclaim my power and dignity in her courtroom had reminded her why she'd wanted to become a judge in the first place, to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, and to ensure that justice prevailed over greed and cruelty. The federal investigation Derek's case triggered has expanded nationwide. The FBI has identified similar elder abuse rings in 12 states, all using variations of the same scheme Derek perfected. My case has become the template for prosecuting these crimes, and the legal precedents we established are being cited in courts across the country. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd been a different kind of woman, someone who trusted too easily, who didn't have for decades of legal experience to draw on, who might have signed those papers and disappeared quietly into that memory care facility. How many other elderly people are out there right now, facing similar schemes, without the knowledge or connections to fight back? That's why I wake up every morning with the same sense of purpose I felt during my judicial career. The work isn't finished. There are more predators out there, more vulnerable seniors being targeted, more families being destroyed by greed disguised as concern. Helen and I meet for lunch every Tuesday at a restaurant near the courthouse, planning our next case, sharing intelligence about suspicious guardianship petitions, coordinating with federal prosecutors who've made elder abuse a priority because of what we accomplished. At 76 and 78, we've become the legal equivalent of undercover cops, using our supposed fragility to expose criminals who think age makes people easy targets. Last week, a woman called our foundation's hotline. Her 82-year-old father was being pressured by his new wife to sign over his house and investments. The wife had brought a lawyer who claimed the father was showing signs of dementia. The daughter was terrified but didn't know how to protect him. Helen and I drove to Evanston that same afternoon. Within 2 hours, we'd identified the same red flags Derek had used: fake medical evaluation, staged evidence of confusion, and a lawyer with a history of questionable guardianship cases. We're working with the FBI to document this new scheme, and I suspect we'll be testifying in another federal courtroom before winter. This morning, as I watched the sunrise over Lake Michigan, I thought about Benjamin and how different his life might have been if he'd lived to see justice served. I thought about Martin and how proud he would have been to watch his wife refuse to go quietly into anyone's definition of old age. I thought about the 4 elderly victims who died before Derek's scheme was exposed, and I promised them that their deaths wouldn't be forgotten. At 76, I've learned that retirement doesn't mean the end of your usefulness, it means the beginning of your fearlessness. When you've already buried a husband and a child, when you've seen the worst humanity has to offer and survived it, when you've spent 4 decades fighting for justice, there's very little left that can intimidate you. Cassandra and Derek thought my age made me an easy target. Instead, it made me the most dangerous opponent they could have chosen. Because here's what predators never understand about women in my generation: we didn't survive the battles of the past 7 decades by being weak. We survived by being stronger than anyone expected, smarter than anyone assumed, and more determined than anyone imagined possible. If this story has touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and let me know what city you're watching from. I always smile when I see messages from places where I've spoken about elder protection or consulted on similar cases. And please, subscribe to this channel and share these stories with anyone who might need to hear them. Because every grandmother, every grandfather, every senior citizen has a story worth protecting. And together, we can make sure their voices are never silenced by those who mistake age for weakness. The sun is fully up now, painting my new home in golden light, and I'm already planning my next case. Because at 76, I'm just getting started.